They were the quiet kings of the American underworld, Frank Nitti in Chicago and Frank Costello in New York. Men who ruled not with bullets, but with ledgers, whispers, and doors that opened at the right knock. They built empires in the shadows, where loyalty was currency and silence was law. But in a world without retirement plans, every rise carries the seed of its own fall. And when the silence finally broke, it was never the gunfire that shocked the world. It was the men it claimed. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. March 19th, 1943, Chicago. The morning begins with the lightest snow, not enough to coat the streets, but just enough to cling to the edges of the windows like frost-bitten lace. Outside, the streets of Riverside are silent. The war has taken the young, the cold has taken the poor. The city, for once, feels as if it's holding its breath. Inside apartment 506 on North Riverside Drive, the air is still. No footsteps, no radio chatter, just the faint hum of a radiator and the occasional moan of wind bending around brick. And in that silence sits Frank Nitti, not the man the newspapers called the enforcer, not the puppet master behind the Chicago outfit's labor rackets, but something smaller now, something folded in on itself. He's seated in a worn brown armchair near the window, one leg crossed awkwardly over the other, a pale wool blanket half draped over his knees like he'd started to cover himself but got distracted midway through. His tan vest is buttoned all the way up, shirt sleeves ironed, collar stiff. The armor of a man who needed control in every detail. But this morning, his tie is missing. A small thing, perhaps, but the kind of thing that speaks volumes when a man like Frank Nitti forgets it. On his lap lies a .32 caliber revolver, not holstered, not hidden, just resting there, heavy and deliberate, like an accusation. His right hand hovers near it, not quite touching, fingers twitching slightly, like they're remembering things they wish they could forget. The gun glints softly in the low morning light, the metal still oiled, the chamber loaded. On the small table to his right, a half-empty glass of rye, no ice. Beside it, a fountain pen, uncapped. And underneath that, a folded sheet of stationery, blank on one side, ink bleeding slowly through on the other. He's been writing, or trying to. The note is short, only 2 lines. I take this only upon myself. Let no one else be hurt. Signed, in a hurried slant, F. Nitti, that was all he could manage. The rest, the weight of the betrayal, the names he wouldn't write down, the deals he'd made that now hung over him like a noose, that would stay unspoken. The radio, perched on a wooden shelf in the corner, plays faintly. It's tuned to WBBM. A commercial for Borden's evaporated milk cuts to a war update. American troops advancing in Tunisia. Roosevelt's name, the Allied front. The kind of world-shaking news that once would have made Frank Nitti lean in, pay attention. But now, it's just static, dressed in words. Because none of that matters anymore. What matters is the subpoena on the kitchen counter. Official, typed in bold. It summons him to testify before a federal grand jury. Labor racketeering, Hollywood union infiltration, wire fraud, extortion. And though he's faced worse before, this time it's different. This time they want him alone. No Rika, no Campagna, no legal team to shuffle papers and twist timelines. Just Nitti, in a courtroom, with federal eyes locked on his every move. He knows why. They've made him the fall guy. Rika and the others, his partners, his so-called friends, have already whispered their plans. He'd heard it in the pauses during meetings, the glance that lingered too long, the absence of a returned phone call. They would hang the Hollywood mess on him, let him take the weight, serve time, keep the outfit clean. It would be neat, efficient, and terminal. He's not afraid of prison. He's done it before. But this time, there's no deal waiting. No light sentence. No quiet bribe to a warden. This time, he's looking at real years. And at 62, with ulcers eating through his gut and nerves twisted into knots, Frank Nitti knows what that means. He closes his eyes. And for a moment, he's not in Riverside. He's back in Brooklyn, 10 years old, shining shoes outside a butcher shop, watching the men in long coats pass by, their voices low, their boots loud. He remembers the smell of raw meat and coal smoke. He remembers the hunger. That hunger shaped everything. It pushed him west, toward Chicago, into the orbit of Al Capone, into a life built on silence, structure, and survival. He was never flashy like Capone, never wanted the headlines or the applause. He wanted order, respect, money that moved without noise. And he got it, for years. They called him the Enforcer, but that was a misread. Frank Nitti didn't inspire fear with fists or gunfire. He did it with systems. He organized bootlegging operations like clockwork. He kept ledgers cleaner than most banks. His genius wasn't chaos, it was control. But now, even that slipped through his fingers. The labor unions that once bowed to his hand are now being investigated. The wiretaps have begun. The FBI is turning over names like stones. And Frank, the man who always planned for every variable, has no moves left. He shifts in his chair, breathes in. The wool blanket slides from his lap. He reaches for the revolver, fingers tightening around the grip. It's colder than he expected. Or maybe it's his hand that's cold. Outside, a trolley rattles past on Riverside Drive. The sound is distant, almost nostalgic. Somewhere in another apartment, a dog begins to bark. Life continues, unaware. Nitti lifts the revolver, holds it near his temple, closes one eye. Click. A misfire. He exhales sharply. No fear, just irritation. He checks the chamber, re-aims. Bang! The second shot tears through the air and misses. It slices through his hat and buries itself in the ceiling. He grimaces now. A sliver of blood drips down from his scalp. His hands are shaking. For the third, he steadies himself. Both hands. No hesitation. Bang! This time, it lands. The revolver clatters to the wooden floor. His body slumps sideways in the chair, lifeless. A dark stain spreads slowly beneath him. It is quiet again. When the police arrive, hours later, they find the door unlocked. The room undisturbed. No sign of forced entry. Just the silence of a man who chose his ending, in his own way. The note still sits on the table. The glass of rye, untouched. Chicago doesn't mourn him. Not openly. The outfit issues no public statement. Rika quietly assumes full control. Newspapers report the suicide with cold distance. Notorious mobster dies by own hand, one headline reads. Labor probe figure found dead, says another. But in certain corners of the city, in backrooms, barbershops, and train yards, the older men lower their voices when they speak his name. They say Frank Nitti didn't run, didn't beg, didn't fold. He looked power in the face and made the only move left. Because in the underworld, there's no retirement plan, no gold watch, no farewell party. Just a quiet apartment, a glass of rye, and a gun in your lap. The boat scraped into New York harbor like a tired whisper. The year was 1906. 12-year-old Francesco Raffaele Nito stood on the upper deck of the SS Princess Irene, gripping the wooden rail with fingers chapped by salt wind. Behind him, the Mediterranean sun, the narrow alleys of Angri, and a father who had vanished long before Francesco understood what death really meant. Ahead of him, a skyline that clawed the sky with chimneys, a city that promised bread, work, and something far crueler. Opportunity, if you could survive it. The Nittos were just another name on the manifest, another family offloaded into the iron gut of Ellis Island. His mother barely spoke English. His younger brother clung to her dress. Francesco, already thin and small for his age, stared at the steel staircases and brick alleys of lower Manhattan like they were puzzle pieces waiting to be broken apart and sold. By 1910, the family had moved into a tenement on Sackett Street in Brooklyn's Red Hook district. The building leaned slightly, as if ashamed. Rats claimed the corners. Coal smoke lingered in every curtain and collar. The nights echoed with coughing, the sound of hunger wrapped in cloth. Francesco's mother took in sewing. The boys ran errands. And by the age of 10, Francesco had his first job, a shoeshine stand under the shadow of a butcher's awning on Columbia Street. He learned early that quiet boys lasted longer, that it was better to observe than to speak, that money liked to change hands quietly, and that people rarely noticed a kid who kept his eyes down and his hands moving. He watched the long coats walk by, watched them tuck envelopes into palms. watched the way people leaned in when certain men approached, like gravity shifted around them. He began to understand a different kind of language, the kind spoken with glances, silence, and timing, the language of power. By age 14, Francesco was running numbers slips for a local tavern owner who moonlighted as a bookie. By 15, he was delivering packages wrapped in brown paper for a man named Tony Soretto, a cousin of a cousin who didn't ask many questions. The pay was good, the danger was better. It gave Francesco something he hadn't had before: control. He changed his name not with ceremony, but out of necessity. Francesco became Frank. Nitto with a single T. Easier to say, easier to forget. A name that could disappear into ink or slide off a witness's tongue. Brooklyn in those years was a living thing, a city within a city. The Italians stayed on their blocks. The Irish had theirs. The Jews, the Poles, the Germans. All divided by invisible borders that only became visible when someone crossed them the wrong way. Violence was a currency. Reputation was capital. And Frank Nitti learned to spend carefully. He didn't carry a gun at first. He didn't need to. His skill was in making himself smaller than the room, quieter than the conversation. He listened, memorized debts, knew which shopkeepers paid on time and which ones needed a reminder. He learned how to stare just long enough to unsettle, but not long enough to challenge. And when he finally did fight, it wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. It was precise. One evening, outside a pool hall on Court Street, a man twice his size tried to push him out of a drop job, said the younger boy should be working tables, not handling money. Frank said nothing, waited until the man turned to light a cigarette. Then he broke the man's nose with a lead pipe tucked in his coat. No words, no warning, just execution. The next day, Tony Soretto gave him a bonus and a nod that meant more than any praise. Frank Nitti was useful, and useful men, especially quiet ones, went far. But Brooklyn had ceilings. No matter how smart you were, how ruthless, eventually you bumped into someone bigger, someone who knew someone. And Frank began to feel that ceiling closing in by the early 1920s. Then came the invitation. Chicago, a new frontier. Prohibition had turned the Midwest into a gold rush of vice. Speakeasies, bootleggers, crooked cops. The city was boiling, and Frank's talents had caught the attention of someone who mattered. It wasn't Capone. Not yet. It was Big Jim Colosimo, a larger-than-life figure in the Chicago underworld. Frank's cousin by marriage, Diamond Jim, ran brothels and gambling dens like royal estates. He needed men who could manage supply chains, enforce territory lines, and make threats without drawing police. He needed men who weren't flashy, men who understood the elegance of structure. Nitti packed what little he owned, left Brooklyn behind. By 1923, he was in Chicago, and everything was about to change. The first thing he noticed was the scale. Chicago wasn't a neighborhood. It was a battleground. From Cicero to the Loop, every block was claimed, contested, or in flux. The streets buzzed not with electricity, but with tension, like something terrible and glorious was always a day away. And at the center of it all, Alphonse Gabriel Capone. Frank met Capone through Colosimo's network, but it wasn't long before Capone saw what others didn't. Nitti wasn't just muscle, he was systemic. He understood roots, profit margins, human behavior. He could balance a ledger, map a supply chain, and read the ambition in another man's silence. By 1924, Nitti was officially working under Capone, managing imports, payouts, and bootleg distribution along the South Side. He kept quiet, stayed out of headlines, and delivered results. Capone, who was as flamboyant as Nitti, was meticulous, came to rely on his calculations more than any triggerman. Frank Nitti never wanted to be feared. He wanted to be essential. And in Chicago, he found a city that rewarded that kind of hunger. The bootlegging business exploded. Shipments ran across Lake Michigan, from Canada to the Windy City. Bribes greased every wheel, judges, aldermen, police chiefs. Everyone had a price, and Frank Nitti kept track of them all, not in ledgers, but in his mind. He never wrote down what could be remembered, never said out loud what could be conveyed in a glance. He wore tailored suits, grey or navy, never flamboyant. His hair always combed, his voice soft, deliberate. He carried a pistol, but rarely used it. His real weapon was order. He saw chaos and carved maps from it. But for all the money and control, Nitti never felt safe. because he knew the truth beneath the empire. Everything built in shadows eventually has to answer to the light. And as the decade turned, the lights were growing brighter. Federal agents began listening, competitors began vanishing, and even inside Capone's circle, trust began to fracture. Nitti began to drink more, but never in public. He took his rye straight, no ice, and preferred silence over jazz. He stayed in modest apartments, even when others bought mansions. And in those quiet hours, staring at maps, counting crates, managing payrolls, he began to wonder if longevity was even possible in this line of work. Brooklyn had taught him survival. Chicago had taught him power. But what it never taught him, and what no city could, was how to let go, how to walk away, how to step off the ladder once you reached the top. Because for men like Frank Nitti, there was only one exit, and it wasn't through the front door. But that ending, that reckoning, still waited years away. For now, he was in his prime. The boy who arrived in New York with empty pockets was now managing a criminal empire that pulled in millions. He no longer shined shoes. Now he shined territory, reputation, roots, relationships. And every move he made, every step he took, was one more brick laid on a path that would someday lead back to that room in Riverside. But on this night, in the middle of winter, with Chicago's air biting through the alleys like a warning, Frank Nitti walked alone past the rail yards, coat buttoned, collar high, eyes forward, not afraid, not proud, just aware that in a world built by men like him, every beginning had already made peace with its end. In Chicago, noise was power. In the 1920s, it took the shape of Tommy guns, jazz bands, breaking glass, and cigar smoke-laced laughter that echoed from underground speakeasies. But not all power announced itself with sound. Some men, the truly dangerous ones, didn't need to shout to be heard. And Frank Nitti was one of them. He didn't burst into a room like Al Capone did. He entered like a shadow that had always been there, pressed against the wall, observing, waiting. The kind of man you didn't notice until you realized the most dangerous person in the room was the one who hadn't said a word. By 1925, Nitti had become indispensable, not just to Capone, but to the entire machinery of the Chicago outfit. He'd earned it not with bullets, but with order. He was the man who turned a criminal empire into a clockwork operation. Every shipment of bootleg liquor, every payoff to a judge, every dock worker on payroll, every bullet ordered and body disappeared. Frank Nitti had a hand in it, even if his name rarely appeared on paper. Capone might have been the face, the fury, the fire, but Nitti was the silence behind it, the still water that ran deep, cold, and full of consequence. The first time Capone really saw him was in the back of a smoke-filled bar on South Wabash Avenue. It was late, a winter night in 1923. Capone was handling a sit-down with two Irish crew leaders over disputed territory near Cicero. The meeting was tense, voices high, threats thinly veiled beneath polite laughter. Capone sat at the head of the table, fedora pushed back, chewing the end of a cigar. Nitti sat 3 chairs away. He hadn't spoken once. He just listened, took in the pace of the conversation, noted which man blinked more, who shifted in his seat, who touched his glass each time money was mentioned. Capone was ready to end the negotiation violently. His fingers drummed the table, his patience frayed. But before anything exploded, Nitti leaned in, just slightly, and said 6 words. "We can buy their accountant instead." That changed everything. Within a week, the Irish crew lost their cash flow. 2 weeks later, they ceded the territory. And Capone, he never forgot who'd delivered the win. From that moment forward, Nitti wasn't just a soldier. He was a strategist. Nitti's official role was vague. Part operations manager, part finance controller, part consigliere. But inside the outfit, titles didn't matter. Results did. He oversaw the liquor routes from Detroit, through Indiana, into the south and west sides of Chicago. He mapped the safest roads, bribed the right cops. And when deals went south, he handled it, quietly. Frank didn't like mess. He preferred efficiency. A missing shipment? He didn't send 5 men with bats. He sent 1 man with a clipboard and a smile. And if that didn't work, then came the man in the overcoat with a .38 in his pocket. He earned the nickname, the Enforcer, not because he broke bones, but because people obeyed him before bones needed to be broken. He didn't posture, he didn't brag, he had no need. If you crossed Frank Nitti, you didn't get a warning. You just vanished. And your ledger entry was marked, resolved. His apartment on West Lexington was modest. 2 rooms, no luxury. Books stacked neatly beside an armchair. A half-full bottle of rye on the shelf. A handgun in the top drawer. Always clean, always loaded. He lived like a man who knew what it meant to have too much attention. He'd seen what fame had done to Johnny Torrio, what it was doing to Capone. Capone lived in the Lexington Hotel like a Roman emperor. Lavish dinners, diamond-studded tie pins, a custom-built desk with secret compartments. His laughter could be heard down the hall. Frank visited often, but never stayed longer than necessary. He respected Capone. They were opposites, and that was why it worked. Capone was magnetic, a force of personality, a man who shook the world awake. But Frank was the hand on the clock, quiet, invisible, keeping everything ticking behind the scenes. In 1926, the outfit was at war with the North Side Gang, led by Jaime Weiss. The violence was escalating. Drive-by shootings became daily events. Restaurants, storefronts, even churches became battlefields. And Capone, for all his bravado, was starting to feel boxed in. Nitti proposed a shift, take the fight off the streets and into the books. Instead of bullets, they'd use money. He engineered payoffs to Weiss's distribution men. He paid bartenders to double count. He bribed landlords to evict Northside safe houses. He cut the gang's legs out from beneath them while they were still aiming at rooftops. By the time Weiss was gunned down outside Holy Name Cathedral in 1926, a hit Nitti helped coordinate but never claimed, the war was over. Not because the North Side lost more men, but because they lost control. And in Nitti's world, control was everything. The following year, 1927, marked the apex of the outfit's bootlegging empire. At its peak, Capone's operation was pulling in $100 million a year, an unfathomable amount for the time. And Nitti knew where every dollar went. He employed accountants, legal clerks, union officials, all under aliases. He set up fake construction firms to launder money. He ran a fleet of trucks disguised as bakery deliveries. And in every room he entered, he knew exactly what time to leave. His genius wasn't just in crime, it was in discipline. Capone called him the only guy who knows how to make a dollar work harder than me. But Frank didn't smile at the compliment. He didn't need praise. He needed the machine to run. He wasn't without flaws. He smoked too much. His ulcers worsened each year. He drank in silence, and he slept lightly, always with the bedroom door cracked open and the hall light on. He carried the weight of what he managed, and what he erased. There were stories, unconfirmed, whispered, about how Nitti would sometimes visit the graves of men he'd ordered gone, never left flowers, just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, for a few minutes, then walked away. No one ever asked him about it, because no one asked Frank Nitti about anything he didn't volunteer. In 1929, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre made headlines around the world. 7 men from Bugs Moran's gang gunned down inside a Lincoln Park garage, dressed as police, lined up against a wall, executed. The newspapers screamed Capone's name, but Nitti's name was absent, as always. That was how he'd designed it. Frank didn't need headlines. He needed operations. While the press chased Capone's shadow, Nitti tightened the books, replaced compromised routes, and recruited new men, quieter, hungrier, more loyal. The outfit didn't falter. It got smarter. And Frank was the reason. He owned no mansions, kept no mistresses, didn't gamble, rarely went out. His only indulgence was control, and even that was kept in check, balanced across ledgers and payoffs and silence. By 1930, Capone's legal troubles had begun. The Treasury Department was on him. Elliot Ness and the Untouchables were coming. Nitti watched from the sidelines, not indifferent, but prepared. Because unlike Capone, Frank Nitti had never needed to be king. He just needed to keep the kingdom from falling apart. And soon, it would be his to manage. Looking back, those years, 1925 to 1931, were Nitti's true ascendancy. Not as a killer, not as a street boss, but as the man who kept the American underworld's most infamous empire from collapsing under its own weight. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't seek revenge with spectacle. He ordered it with a nod. He enforced it with math. And he survived because he understood something most men in his business never did. Loud men die first. By the time Al Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison in 1931, Nitti didn't celebrate. He didn't mourn. He simply got to work, took over operations, cleaned up the books, silenced loose ends. and stepped into the shadows where he always belonged. He never wore the crown, but make no mistake, Frank Nitti was already king. The quiet muscle, the silent blade, the enforcer, who rarely had to speak to make a man kneel. At the edge of Lake Michigan, the black water rolls like oil beneath a silver sky. It is just past midnight, and a thick fog clings to the shoreline. Far out in the haze, a small boat drifts toward a waiting truck parked behind an abandoned grain silo. No headlights, no voices, just the squeak of boots on wet wood, and the sound of crates being quietly offloaded onto cold steel. Inside each crate, glass bottles packed in straw, labels peeled clean. Canadian whiskey, disguised as dairy shipments. 1,000 cases by morning. $1 million by month's end. This was Frank Nitti's kingdom. An empire built not with bullets, but with blueprints. By 1927, Chicago was fire and fortune. Prohibition wasn't just law. It was opportunity sculpted in marble. And while Al Capone grinned for newspaper photographers and barked from the suite of the Lexington Hotel, Frank Nitti stayed in the shadows, managing an operation that ran deeper than blood. The system was elegant. Booze came in from Windsor, Ontario. Smugglers ran it across Lake St. Clair to Detroit. From there, it snaked its way by road and rail to Chicago, always through trusted hands, always on time. Once it hit the city, it was Nitti's show. He had dock bosses on the south side, police captains on retainer, teamster foremen who rerouted trucks, and ward aldermen who ensured silence with sealed envelopes. Every bottle had a route. Every shipment had a number. And every man in the chain, from janitor to judge, was either paid, pressured, or removed. He didn't trust luck. He trusted structure. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. Brawls in speakeasies, bloody turf wars, backroom deals and cigar smoke. But Nitti saw it like a master sees a chessboard. Each piece, each move, each consequence. Capone was the showman. Nitti was the machine. He kept a rotating schedule of warehouses. One on Halstead, disguised as a meatpacking plant. One in Cicero, under the false front of a wholesale bakery. Another in Bridgeport, where crates were marked as plumbing equipment. Each warehouse was managed by someone Frank had either grown up with or saved from a noose. And that loyalty, absolute, unquestioned, enduring, was the currency he prized most. More than cash, more than territory, more than fear. If you worked under Nitti and you followed the rules, you lived well. If you didn't, you were gone. He kept the books clean, not sanitized, not innocent, just precise. Frank Nitti was an accountant in a world of arsonists, and he understood that the only way to run a criminal empire was to make it run like a business. Each delivery was logged, not under real names, but codes. Each bribe documented, hidden inside dummy invoices for waste disposal, repair fees, or municipal consulting. The ledgers were stored in a safe behind a false wall in a West Side garage, triple locked, guarded by a mechanic who never looked up from his bench. There were no loose lips, only numbers. And numbers don't testify. But power, even silent power, breeds paranoia. By 1929, Nitti knew something was shifting. The air had changed. The city buzzed with whispers. Elliot Ness, the Untouchables, wiretaps, subpoenas, tax cases. The federal government couldn't bust Capone for murder. Too many bodies had been buried too well. But money? That left footprints. And Nitti was the man who had built the trail. He started to move more cautiously, used different phone lines each day, never traveled the same route twice, left meetings early, arrived late. He even began carrying a second revolver, tucked inside his left boot, just in case. He trusted no one completely, not even Capone, not anymore. The outfit's reach had expanded into city government. Elections were purchased like cigars. Councilmen answered their phones with the phrase, "How much this time?" But behind the luxury, the cracks widened. In 1930, the Volstead Act was still in full swing, the law that gave teeth to prohibition. But Nitti didn't fear alcohol laws. He feared paperwork. The IRS had begun sniffing around. Not just Capone's taxes, everyone's. Judges, unions, property titles. Nitti knew if they got close to the books, the whole machine could come crashing down. So he rewrote the playbook. He stopped keeping records in ledgers, switched to a system of rotating verbal reports. Each manager briefed only on their tier, never the whole. He replaced 2 warehouse supervisors who asked too many questions. One was found floating in the Calumet River. The other disappeared entirely, last seen boarding a streetcar on Kedzie Avenue. Frank didn't like killing. He saw it as a disruption, messy, loud, wasteful. But when necessary, he sanctioned it without hesitation. Clean, discreet, final. The message was never spoken. It didn't need to be. Meanwhile, Capone only grew bolder. Parties at the Lexington lasted until dawn. Diamonds on his cufflinks. Lobsters in his bathtub. He had a barber on call at all hours. A bodyguard named Frank Rio who once shot a man for looking too long. And a custom silk robe embroidered with AC. Frank watched all of it with quiet disdain. He knew excess attracted heat. That one headline could bring 10 subpoenas. That flash without discipline always led to collapse. But Capone wasn't listening anymore, and Nitti, always the lieutenant, never the throne seeker, stayed silent. He focused on the numbers, the trucks, the docks, the bribes. He tried to keep the fire from reaching the walls. But fire, when fed long enough, consumes everything. By 1931, Elliot Ness had assembled a special task force. 10 men who couldn't be bribed, couldn't be threatened, and didn't blink. They kicked in warehouse doors, seized shipment logs, flipped low-level drivers, tracked delivery trucks. And slowly, methodically, they began to reconstruct the web that Frank Nitti had spent a decade weaving. They didn't go after the murders, they went after the math. And eventually, they came for Capone, charging him not with murder, but tax evasion. When the verdict came down, Nitti didn't celebrate. He didn't exhale. He knew what it meant. Capone was going away. 11 years. Federal prison. No appeals. The headlines called it justice. Nitti called it vacancy. With Capone gone, the outfit didn't dissolve. It adapted. Frank Rika, Paul Rika, and Nitti himself stepped into the power vacuum, each handling a piece of the machine. But it was Frank Nitti who kept the finances intact, who ensured the judges still took calls, who reminded every dock worker and beat cop where their loyalty came from. And yet, even as he rose to unofficial leadership, he never looked comfortable in the light. He still dressed in greys and browns, still took side entrances, still left his drink half finished. He carried himself like a man whose empire was made of matches, and he could hear the spark, because by now the walls were closing in. Too many agents, too many betrayals, too many years spent balancing a world on the edge of a razor. Frank Nitti had built an empire in a city on fire, but the fire was catching up. The room where they sentenced Al Capone smelled like old wood and damp wool. It was October 24th, 1931, a cold day in Chicago. Inside the federal courthouse, the jury filed in silently. No sound except the scratch of a fountain pen, the rustle of a newspaper folded in half. Capone didn't look at the judge when the sentence came down. 11 years in federal prison. The once untouchable king of Chicago was being buried not by bullets, but by accounting ledgers. Frank Nitti wasn't in the courtroom. He already knew what the verdict would be. The real trial, the one that mattered, was happening elsewhere. It was about what came next. Capone's arrest left the Chicago outfit in a state of quiet freefall. For years, everything had revolved around his gravity, his voice, his presence, his arrogance. He'd held the throne with laughter and fear, cigars and champagne. Now the throne sat empty, and the men who had once orbited him began looking at each other sideways. Frank Nitti stepped into the vacuum with no speech, no celebration, no crown. He just showed up, sat at the head of the table at Rika's warehouse, opened the ledger, and began talking about shipments. There were no objections, because power doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it walks in the back door, wipes its shoes, and gets to work. But Nitti wouldn't hold that seat for long, at least not at first. In 1932, less than a year after Capone's sentencing, Nitti was arrested. The charges were vague at first. Bootlegging, tax fraud, conspiracy. The feds didn't need to be precise. They needed a symbol. And with Capone locked away, Frank Nitti's name had started showing up more often in typewritten reports, whispered debriefings, and agent memos scrawled in the margins of case files. He was sent to Leavenworth, 18 months. A light sentence compared to what they'd hoped. Still, it was enough to send a message. Leavenworth Prison stood like a fortress carved into stone. Thick limestone walls, barbed wire curling like iron thorns along the perimeter. Inside, men moved slowly, eyes down, shoulders high. Time bent strangely there, days folding into each other like shuffled cards. Nitti didn't speak much. He kept to himself, rising early, exercising alone, refusing visits. He wasn't afraid, but he was calculating, watching, learning. He read newspapers in the yard, marked names mentally, noted which allies visited and which didn't. It wasn't prison that unnerved him. It was uncertainty. What was happening on the outside? Were the others loyal? Would the Empire still be standing when he walked out? The world rarely waits for quiet men, but the world did wait. When Nitti was released in 1933, the outfit had not crumbled. It had evolved. Frank Ricker and Paul, the waiter. Ricker had kept the operation breathing, but everyone knew who the structure belonged to. The man who returned wasn't diminished. He was sharper, quieter still, and far more dangerous. Prison hadn't broken him. It had focused him. He stepped back into the leadership role without friction. Because while other gangsters brought storms, Nitti brought stability. And in a city drowning in blood and bribes, stability was a rare and precious thing. The first thing he did was shift focus. Bootlegging was drying up. Prohibition was on its last legs. By December of that same year, the 21st Amendment would end the nationwide ban on alcohol. The outfit's golden pipeline was vanishing. But Nitti didn't flinch. He saw it coming, and he had already made plans. He turned the outfit's gaze toward a different kind of empire. One built not on alcohol, but labor. Construction unions, teamsters, movie projectionists, stagehands, dock workers. Wherever people lifted crates, rolled reels, or moved freight, Frank Nitti planted flags. Because labor wasn't flashy. It didn't bleed in alleys or scream in headlines. But it paid. Consistently. Quietly. Forever. Hollywood, especially, caught his attention. In the early 1930s, the film industry was booming. Studios like MGM and Paramount controlled massive budgets and powerful unions. If you could control the unions, you could control the studios. If you could control the studios, you could write your own checks. Nitti sent men to Los Angeles. They weren't actors. They were fixers. They began pressuring the projectionist union, leaning on local crew bosses, offering protection to set workers. By 1935, portions of Hollywood's behind-the-scenes labor force were indirectly answering to Chicago. Money flowed back to the outfit in suitcases, envelopes, and coded bank drafts. West Coast producers paid quietly, because they understood what silence bought. And if they didn't, a film reel might go missing. A set might mysteriously burn. A crew might walk off without warning. Nitti had discovered a new racket, one that didn't need bullets, just leverage, and he applied it with precision. Back in Chicago, the labor strategy deepened. Construction sites were shut down mid-project until the right palms were greased. Union votes were manipulated behind closed doors. New leaders were elected with assistance from visiting men in grey coats who said little and left less. Nitti's operations weren't built on threats. They were built on inevitability. The question was never if you'd pay. It was when. He wore dark suits, kept his tie tight, and still walked like a man half his size. Carefully, deliberately, like each step might crack something beneath him if taken too quickly. He spoke softly, rarely smiled. When he did, it usually meant a deal was about to close, or that someone was about to disappear. He wasn't theatrical. He wasn't loud. He was the stillness in a room after the lights went out. But power, in any form, always demands something in return. The deeper Nitti pushed into labor racketeering, the more scrutiny he drew. Unions were federal property, their finances, their votes, their pensions. And with federal oversight came new enemies. By 1938, the FBI had opened quiet investigations. A young prosecutor in Washington named Robert Murphy began tracking financial links between film studios, union kickbacks, and Chicago syndicates. The noose was tightening again. But this time, it wasn't Capone in the crosshairs. It was Nitti. And the weight of leadership, the very thing he had always worn so carefully, was beginning to press harder on his spine. Still, he kept going. Because he didn't know how to stop. The empire had grown large. Too large, perhaps. Its roots stretched from the meatpacking plants of Cicero to the backlots of California. Every dollar he earned seemed to carry more heat. Every silence he purchased echoed longer. And yet, Frank Nitti held it all together. Because that's what he did. Because no one else could. Because if he didn't, everything would fall. He never celebrated his rise. Never wrote a memoir. Never gave an interview. There were no statues, no toasts, no dramatic speeches. Just a man in a grey suit, managing power in silence. A man who once shined shoes on Sackett Street. Who crossed oceans with nothing in his pockets. Who built an empire beneath a city that never stopped burning. Frank Nitti didn't conquer Chicago. He inherited its ghosts and tried to keep them quiet. The contract sat on the corner of his desk. Just a few sheets of paper, stapled clean, lined with government seals and phrases like deposition, subpoena, prosecution recommendation. But to Frank Nitti, it may as well have been a bullet, because the men who had once killed with lead were now using paper. It was early 1943. The war raged in Europe. Chicago froze under a steel-grey sky. And inside the second-floor office of the Randolph Street building that Nitti used as his command post, the world was beginning to unravel. Not with screams, but with silence. The money had been too easy. Since the mid-1930s, Frank Nitti had turned the outfit's attention to Hollywood, where film studios bloated with Depression-era profits were quietly negotiating with unions that controlled everything behind the camera. Projectionists, truck drivers, set constructors, the men who moved equipment, who kept film reels spinning, who lit the stages and packed up the dreams when the cameras stopped rolling. And those men had pensions. They had dues. They had votes. They had power. Nitti didn't need to control the studios. He just needed the men who unplugged the lights. By 1936, the outfit had its hooks in the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, the IATSE. Union leaders like Willie Bioff and George Brown answered to Chicago now, even if they lived under palm trees and held court in Culver City. They collected kickbacks from film studios in exchange for labor peace. No strikes, no slowdowns, no missing trucks. And in return, the outfit skimmed the top. Thousands of dollars a week flowed east in cash bundles stuffed into suitcases, train car compartments, and tightly sealed envelopes marked legal fees. Some weeks, it was $50,000. Others, more. The ledgers didn't track it, but Nitti did. In his head, always in his head. He rarely left Chicago. Hollywood was a spectacle, a world of faces and flashes, of parties and white smiles. Frank had no use for any of it. He preferred back doors and rolled cuffs, the creak of his chair behind the books, and the smell of ink and rye. But he watched, and he listened. He understood that control didn't require presence, just leverage. So he let Bioff be the messenger, let Brown shake the hands, let California think it was autonomous, and he kept pulling strings from his grey office above the streetcar lines. But then, in 1941, a small memo leaked from Washington. An assistant U.S. attorney in Los Angeles flagged irregularities in union funds. A few weeks later, the IRS got involved, then the FBI. Bioff was arrested first, a flashy man in silk suits who panicked the moment he saw the warrant. He cracked like a plate dropped from a second-story window. Within days, he was naming names. Not just Brown, not just union associates, but the real architects, the ones from Chicago. He named Rika, he named Campagna, and worst of all, he named Nitti. Frank's hands trembled when he read the statement. He sat alone in his apartment on North Riverside Drive, the sunlight barely cutting through the dirty blinds. The window was opened slightly, and cold air rolled across the floor like smoke. In front of him, the confession, typed, signed, black ink bleeding through the page. Frank Nitti, it read, Chief Architect. He folded the paper slowly, precisely, like folding a shroud, and he understood, in that moment, what it meant to be expendable. Rika and Campagna called for a meeting. It was brief, quiet, no raised voices. They sat across from Nitti at the corner of a Southside hotel lounge, polite, measured, like businessmen negotiating the price of salt. They said the outfit needed insulation, that someone had to fall, that the feds were watching too closely. But Frank had always known the rules. He stared at them for a long time, said nothing. Then Rika leaned forward and slid a small folder across the table. Inside, instructions for a guilty plea, details of a sentence. 5 years, maybe 7. No appeal. A quiet surrender. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a death sentence without a gun, and they expected him to sign it. Frank walked out into the night alone. The streets were wet from snowmelt. Street lamps hummed softly above the silence. He turned down a narrow alley off Canal Street, pulled his coat tighter, and leaned against a brick wall. He lit a cigarette, but his hands shook too much to hold the match steady. The flame flickered, then died. And for the first time in decades, Frank Nitti felt powerless. Not because he had lost the empire, but because he realized it had never really been his. He had built it, balanced it, run it like a machine. But when the gears shifted, when the heat came down, they had chosen to cut him loose. He began to unravel slowly. Missed meetings, delayed phone calls, whiskey during daylight, paranoia creeping in like water through cracked stone. He would sit at his desk and stare at the door, waiting for the knock. Not the police, not the feds, but the other kind. The kind you didn't see coming. He stopped answering his phone at home, took to walking the alleys at night, moved through his days like a man already half gone. He kept the revolver loaded, not out of habit, but out of a quiet, growing certainty. Because when trust dies, a man has to decide what part of himself to bury with it. The newspapers didn't know yet. The public still saw him as a ghost, the silent enforcer, the bookkeeper behind Capone. But inside the outfit, the word had spread. Nitti was cracking. Rica had taken more control. Campagna was positioning new lieutenants. And Bioff's trial was looming. The empire still stood, but its architect was collapsing. One evening, just before spring, Nitti sat in his office long after everyone had left. The lights were dim. A single lamp glowed over his ledger, untouched. The blinds were half drawn, casting striped shadows across his hands. He opened a drawer, took out the folder from Rica, read it again, then again. He reached for a pen, paused, put it down. Then he pulled the revolver from the bottom drawer, checked the chamber. 3 bullets. He closed it and set it gently in his lap. He didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't plead. He just stared into the quiet and breathed. The betrayal didn't hurt as much as the understanding did. That everything he'd built, every ledger, every bribe, every carefully calculated move, had been nothing more than a bridge they walked across. And now they wanted him to jump from it. But not yet. Not tonight. He slid the gun back into the drawer, locked it, stood up, and straightened his tie. Because even in ruin, Frank Nitti would choose his moment. On his terms. March 19th, 1943. The sun hadn't yet broken the sky. It was the kind of morning Chicago forgets by noon. Damp, colorless, quiet, in a way that made the sound of your own footsteps seem too loud. There was still frost clinging to the weeds between the gravel. The wind blew soft, just enough to move the soot-black air over the tracks. Frank Nitti stood alone at the edge of the Illinois Central rail yard behind his riverside home. No coat, no hat, just a tan suit, a grey scarf loose around his neck, and a pair of brown leather shoes that looked too polished for a morning like this. In one pocket, a crumpled note, folded once. In the other, a .32 caliber revolver. He hadn't told anyone. No bodyguards, no driver, not even his wife. He'd waited until the house was quiet, slipped out through the back gate before sunrise. No keys, no breakfast, no farewells. Because this wasn't a conversation. This was a decision. The previous week had sealed it. A grand jury was forming. Federal prosecutors were preparing indictments tied to the Hollywood extortion scheme. Bioff had testified. Brown too. Rica and Campagna, the men he once trusted like blood, had signed his name to the fall. They didn't ask him. They didn't warn him. They delivered the betrayal like lawyers hand over a will. Cold, formal, final. The guilt would land squarely on Frank Nitti. He would be indicted, tried, imprisoned. There would be no negotiation, no backroom favors. This time, the feds wanted a conviction, a visible one. And Frank knew what prison meant now. He wasn't the man he'd been in 1932. Not the quiet tactician, fresh from Leavenworth with a sharpened mind. Now his stomach was rotting from ulcers. His nerves were fraying. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. He'd already been sentenced. Only the ceremony remained. So he chose the place. He chose the time. He chose the silence. The railroad tracks behind the house weren't special. There was no symbolism in the gravel, no hidden message in the rusted rails. They were just quiet, and far enough from the city that no one would hear the sound. He stepped carefully, his feet crunching through frost and coal dust. There were 3 sets of tracks, parallel. No train schedules at this hour, just empty metal stretching toward the horizon. He stopped beside a wooden signal post. A half-fallen board leaned sideways at the base, splintered where weather had chewed through it. He knelt, not out of reverence, but to balance. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the revolver. It was oiled, clean, loaded. He exhaled. The morning air steamed softly from his mouth. Then, without pause, he pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. A misfire. The chamber had jammed, or the round had failed. He didn't flinch, just tilted the barrel, adjusted the grip, and tried again. The second shot fired. It tore through his hat, missed his skull by inches. Still, no panic. He adjusted once more. The third shot went clean. A muffled report, swallowed by the wind. His body slumped backward, collapsing against the gravel like a curtain drawn fast. Blood pooled around the ties. One shoe twisted sideways. The revolver landed 2 feet from his hand. There were no witnesses. No one screamed. No one ran. Just the slow dawn crawling up the edge of the sky. The first person to find him was a railroad worker, around 9:00 a.m. The man thought it was a vagrant at first, another drunk who'd stumbled too close to the tracks. Then he saw the suit, the watch, the folded note in the jacket pocket. He didn't touch anything. He called the police. And then he sat on a nearby crate, staring into the wind. When the detectives arrived, they recognized the body immediately. Frank Nitti, age 57, 5 feet 4, 140 pounds. Crisp cuffs, pressed collar, a stain spreading across his chest like ink dropped in water. The note was short. I take this only upon myself. Let no one else be hurt. God forgive me. Signed simply, F. Nitti. The newspapers erupted by midday. Nitti takes own life ahead of indictment. Underworld king dies by his own hand. Chicago's last ghost falls silent. But none of them knew what really happened. Not the way it had felt. Not the way the gravel had pressed against his knee. Not the sound of the shot. They filled columns with theories, speculation, phrases like mob code and end of an era. But the truth was simpler. Frank Nitti had been betrayed by the system he helped build, not by his enemies, but by his own. Rica and Campagna never visited his widow. They never sent flowers. They sent their lawyer. His funeral was private. No parade, no choir. A few old friends. A priest. And a silence so thick it seemed to hang over the coffin like smoke. He was buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery, just 2 plots over from Al Capone. But there was no ceremony, no final speech. Just a man whose name had once moved cities, now written in stone beneath the cold earth. For years afterward, his name would linger like an echo, in courtrooms, in whisper networks, in the nervous glances of men who had once followed his orders. But eventually, the world moved on. The outfit adapted. Hollywood found new fixes. The unions shifted hands. And Frank Nitti became a footnote. The man who died on the tracks, alone, with a revolver in his lap, and no one left to call him brother. His empire was real, his discipline unmatched, his silence legendary. But in the end, what consumed him wasn't the law. It wasn't Elliot Ness. It wasn't the public or the press. It was something older, something colder, something that visits men who spend too many years walking the line between fear and loyalty. It was the weight of knowing that when the empire needed a scapegoat, he would be the first name on the line, not because he failed, but because he succeeded too well. The tracks are still there today, rust running down the rails, the signal post long since replaced. No plaque, no marker, no trace of the man who died there, just gravel and wind and the silence he left behind. There are no books written by Frank Nitti, no tell-all memoirs, no final interviews with cigarette smoke curling into dictaphones, no last words quoted in court. There is only the silence, and the places where his name was never written, but always understood. Chicago has long been a city of ghosts. Names that once ruled blocks now echo from barbershops and courtrooms, drifting into alleyways lined with cigarette butts and stained newspapers. Al Capone, the name remains loud, still shouted in Hollywood scripts and tourist bus tours. his face frozen in a grin, his legacy carved in bold letters. But Frank Nitti, his name is spoken softer, almost reluctantly, as though even now, to say it too clearly might invite a consequence. He was not a king. He wore no crown, but he governed more than most men ever knew. From the back room of a bar in Cicero, from a payphone outside a union hall, from a two-room office above a laundry business on Randolph Street, Frank Nitti managed an empire through whispers, through glances, through silence paid in full. There are no monuments to him, but his fingerprints, they're pressed into the very structure of American vice. He touched prohibition, turning smuggling into art. He touched labor, turning unions into revenue machines. He touched Hollywood, turning scripts into ledgers. And he touched power, always just enough, never so much that it reflected back at him too brightly. Even now, decades after his death, when federal cases list the history of organized crime, his name surfaces between the lines. In 1950, during the Kefauver hearings, a senator asked an investigator about the old Chicago hierarchy. "Who was Nitti?" he asked. The agent replied, "The man who ran the books, the man who never spoke, but if your name was on his list, you were either rich or buried." He didn't like photographs. Most of the surviving images show him walking with his head slightly down, his hat brim low, his hands tucked behind his back, a faint squint, as if the world had too much light, and he'd already seen enough. There's one photo, taken just after his brief stint in Leavenworth, where he's adjusting his tie, looking toward a courthouse door. His face is unreadable, but there's something in his posture. Not defiance, not regret, but detachment, like the outcome was already accounted for. He didn't crave the limelight. He didn't hold press conferences. He didn't boast in front of flashbulbs or flash wads of cash in restaurants. But he had everything a man could want. Money, loyalty, fear. He could make a phone call at midnight and have a man disappear by morning. He could end a strike with a 2-word message. He could take a union election and reroute it before the ballots were counted. And yet, he never held a title. He never ran for boss. He was never the face. He was the architecture. Capone made history, but Nitti made systems, and it is systems that survive. Even his enemies admitted his genius. Federal agents who couldn't indict him privately described him as disciplined, unshakable, the most dangerous kind of operator. He didn't break laws flamboyantly. He bent them slowly, like wire warmed over flame. Judges owed him favors. Union bosses feared his calls. Politicians in 3 states preferred not to say his name at all. And those who crossed him? They either changed sides or they disappeared. By the late 1940s, the outfit had evolved again. Frank Nitti was long buried. But the foundations he built, the union rackets, the Hollywood schemes, the quiet bribe ladders reaching from dock worker to mayor, those remained. Even the men who replaced him used his blueprint. In many ways, his greatest trick wasn't surviving gang wars, or outmaneuvering Capone's downfall, or controlling Hollywood from 2,000 miles away. It was this. Frank Nitti designed an empire that ran without him. Legacy is a strange thing in the underworld. Some men want to be remembered with statues, others with fear. Frank Nitti, he left no last quote, no manifesto, no heir to claim his name. But even now, his story leaks through the cracks, in declassified memos, in whispered family names, in a dusty photograph buried in a box of evidence marked closed. To understand him, you have to look in the places where people stopped talking. A bribe that wasn't collected, a building permit approved too quickly, a man who rose too fast in a local union. He didn't leave stories. He left patterns. And perhaps that's the most fitting end for a man like Frank Nitti. Not a shootout, not a courtroom, not applause, but gravel under his knees, a pistol in hand, a note folded tight in his jacket, a quiet fall on an unremarkable stretch of train tracks. No flash, no fire, just a final choice, made alone. In the decades that followed, others would take his place. Rica, Accardo, Giancana. Some lived longer, some died louder, but none moved with the precision of Frank Nitti. None whispered with such weight. None built something so vast without once raising their voice. In a world full of gangsters who wanted to be seen, Frank Nitti chose to disappear, piece by piece, until only his influence remained. And when you trace that influence, you'll find it behind contracts, behind ballots, behind freight routes and film reels and cold courthouse ledgers. You'll find a man who spoke rarely, and when he did, it was only to enforce, not with threats, but with inevitability. Frank Nitti never wanted to be famous. He just wanted to be unavoidable, and in that, he succeeded. Washington, D.C., May 1951. The room was built for silence. Dark wood panels climbed the walls. Brass nameplates glinted under government lighting. Reporters hunched forward over spiral notebooks, pencils trembling slightly between fingers. Above them, television cameras rolled, slow, loud, heavy things. Machines designed not to forget. The man seated at the witness table did not look extraordinary. His suit was neatly pressed, charcoal grey with thin lapels. A soft blue tie, knotted tight, rested just beneath a starched white collar. His hair was slicked back, not a strand out of place. His shoulders slouched slightly, not out of weakness, but out of calculation. A man trained to never take up more space than necessary. Only his hands were visible on camera. The rest, the eyes, the jaw, the expression, stayed just below frame. Because Frank Costello had made one thing very clear. If the Senate wanted his answers, they could have them, but they would not get his face. Across from him, the senators sat like an inquisition draped in patriotism. Clean suits, furrowed brows, every man with a microphone and an agenda. Senator Estes Kefauver, the chair of the committee, leaned forward. His voice was calm, clipped, rehearsed. "Mr. Costello," he asked, "what have you done for your country?" There was a long pause, not for effect, but because Frank Costello, even now, under oath, was measuring the truth. His left hand tapped lightly against the table. 3 taps, then stillness. He adjusted the microphone, and finally, he answered. "I paid my tax," he said. The voice was gravel wrapped in silk. Low, deliberate, unmistakably old New York. It filled the chamber like smoke. That was all he said, but it was enough. Millions were watching. For the first time in history, the American public had been invited into the inner workings of organized crime, not through newspapers or rumors, but through a black and white television screen. They didn't see his eyes. They didn't see his expression, but they heard the voice, and the voice became myth. The man who could outtalk senators, the gangster who never raised his voice, but never bent either. For those who knew him, it wasn't a surprise. Frank Costello had always been a creature of precision. Born Francesco Castiglia in Calabria, Italy, in 1891. He'd arrived in East Harlem before he was 5. The streets were cold, loud, and merciless. The boys who survived learned to disappear before they learned to speak. But Costello didn't disappear. He watched. He listened. He figured out what people wanted, before they asked. As a teenager, he ran with Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. They weren't just street punks. They were engineers of something new. A syndicate built on logic, not lineage. Violence was a tool, not an identity. And Costello's tool of choice had always been words. By the 1920s, he'd mastered the business of bootlegging. By the 1930s, he was called the Prime Minister of the underworld. Not by enemies, but by allies. Because while others used fists, he used policy. He knew mayors. He dined with governors. He whispered in the ears of judges. He was the man behind the curtain, consigliere to cities, the gentleman who never had to shout. And now, in this marble tomb of a Senate hearing, Frank Costello was putting on his final act. He didn't argue, didn't threaten, didn't plead. He simply answered, when he chose to, and with just enough vagueness to stay above water. "Do you control the slot machines in Louisiana? I don't recall the details. Do you have an interest in certain banks in New York? I'm just a businessman. Do you know why you're here, Mr. Costello? I was subpoenaed." His face never appeared on screen, only his fingers, tapping, fidgeting, occasionally holding a glass of water, trembling ever so slightly. And yet, America was hypnotized. He was the voice of the underworld, not shouting, not sweating, but calm, unapologetic, measured. It was as if the mob itself had leaned in and whispered, "We're smarter than you think, and we're not going anywhere." Behind the scenes, FBI analysts scribbled notes. The Bureau wanted blood. They wanted evidence, confession, some legal angle to twist into an indictment. But Costello offered only smoke, hints, half-truths wrapped in perfect grammar. J. Edgar Hoover called it a disgrace. But Hoover had never understood men like Frank Costello. Because Costello didn't believe in theatrics. He believed in influence. He left the hearing quietly. No handcuffs. No mugshots. Just a nod to his attorney, and the slow click of polished shoes down a marble hallway. He was found in contempt of court, served 18 months in prison. But to the public, he had won, because no one remembered the verdict. They remembered the voice. It drifted into legend. Old-timers in East Harlem would imitate it on stoops. Comedians in smoky nightclubs would mimic the cadence. I paid my tax. Even years later, when younger mobsters wanted to mock the old days, they'd quote Frank Costello's Senate line like it was scripture. Because in that moment, beneath the lights, the cameras, the pressure, he had stood alone, and he had made power sound civilized. There would be more years, more shadows, more whispers. But for millions, this was how they would remember him. Not in handcuffs, not at a gravesite, not in a bar brawl or a back alley, but seated calmly before the United States government, refusing to show his face and reminding the world that real power doesn't shout. It speaks once and is heard forever. The dirt roads of Calabria cracked under the sun like old skin. It was 1891, and the southern hills of Italy held little more than olive trees, aching hands, and quiet men born with too many mouths to feed. Francesco Castiglia was born into that silence. He came into the world with no silver spoon, no bloodline of prestige, just a mother who worked too hard and a father who dreamed of a better street. And by the time Francesco turned 4, that dream had a destination: New York. They didn't land with wealth. They landed with names they couldn't pronounce and addresses scribbled on ship manifests like afterthoughts. The Castiglia family settled in East Harlem, where the rent was cheap and the walls were thin. It was a neighborhood carved into ethnic territories, the Irish on one side, the Jews on another, and the Italians, stuck in between, climbing fire escapes and hoping the landlord forgot to collect. Francesco grew up fast. By the time he was 10, he'd learned 3 things: how to run, how to listen, and how to make himself valuable to the men who didn't smile. He wasn't big, wasn't threatening, but he had eyes that watched everything, not like a thief, but like an accountant. He noticed who owed who, which butcher had his scale rigged, which cop could be bought with a bottle, which numbers runner made pickups in the rain, even when no one was betting. And those eyes, quiet, steady, full of calculation, got noticed. He started small. Errands for local gambling dens, drop-offs for bookies, messages between backroom poker games and corner cigar shops. By 12, he wasn't running numbers, he was collecting them. And it was around then that he met Salvatore Lucania, the boy who would become Lucky Luciano. They weren't friends in the way kids usually are. They didn't joke much, they didn't share secrets. But they understood each other. And in a neighborhood like theirs, understanding was everything. A few years later, they'd meet Meyer Lansky, the Jewish boy from the Lower East Side with a mind for math and a temper that ran hot beneath a frozen exterior. Together, they weren't a gang. They were a theory in motion. Each brought something sharp to the table: Luciano's ambition, Lansky's logic, and Castiglia's ability to move between the two, translating force into finesse. By the time he was 16, Francesco had shared his birth name, not by law, by instinct. He understood branding before anyone called it that. In East Harlem, Francesco Castiglia sounded like a shoeshine boy. But Frank Costello, that sounded like someone who didn't get his hands dirty, because he didn't have to. And so, Frank Costello was born, not in church, not in a hospital, but in the back room of a speakeasy, behind a ledger, under the watchful gaze of men who saw him and nodded once. That was all he ever needed. While other boys chased girls or brawled over turf, Frank studied how to make people feel safe. That was his gift. He knew how to ease a room. When cops showed up, he smiled first. When disputes flared, he didn't shout. He poured a drink, sat down, lowered his voice. "Let's figure it out," he'd say. And somehow, always, they did. It was negotiation not as compromise, but as domination in disguise. He wasn't violent, not because he was weak, but because he knew that violence was loud, and loud men died early. He watched as tough guys got stabbed over a card game or shot outside butcher shops for debts they never intended to repay. Frank didn't gamble, didn't drink heavy, didn't boast. He read people, mapped outcomes, knew when to let someone win, and when to collect with a smile. By 1920, Prohibition had made street kids into kings, and Frank Costello, still barely 30, was already advising men twice his age. He built a bootlegging operation with Luciano and Lansky that moved liquor not just by the case, but by the boxcar. They paid off truck routes, rented entire warehouses, bribed judges in whispers. Frank's role? He handled the permits, the licenses, the paper trails that didn't lead anywhere real. He made the crooked world look clean. He forged what the newspapers would later call a respectable front. But in truth, it was more than a front. It was a new kind of underworld, one where the killers didn't sit at the head of the table, where the man pulling strings didn't carry a gun, but a briefcase. Frank Costello had seen the future, and it looked like political invitations, not police lineups. He began making donations, quietly, modestly, to churches, to neighborhood committees, to local politicians who needed favors but didn't want to know names. He backed Tammany Hall candidates, helped union bosses rise, funded civic campaigns no one else touched. In return, he didn't ask for loyalty. He expected it. He could make a judge look the other way, make a senator take a phone call at 2 a.m., make a city contract appear in the hands of a friend overnight. And the beauty of it, there was no blood, just signatures. He never forgot East Harlem. Even as he moved uptown, bought property, wore suits that cost more than his mother's rent, he still visited the old neighborhood, not for sentiment, but to remember the math, that every man had a price, that every handshake had a motive, that power, once understood, wasn't loud or violent. It was patient. People say you can spot a real gangster by the way he enters a room, but with Frank Costello, you noticed when he left, because the conversation would change, the air would shift, and the men who once puffed their chests would now be looking over their shoulders. He never threatened, he just suggested. He never shouted, he just answered questions with questions. And when he walked away, deals were already done. That was his rise, built not on violence, but on calmness as a weapon. In a world filled with chaos, Frank Costello learned how to be the pause, the man who didn't need to scream to be heard. So when he finally stood before the Senate in 1951, refusing to show his face, answering in half phrases with a voice smooth as gravel, that wasn't defiance, that was full circle. The boy from Calabria, the son of Harlem, the whisperer who became a king without wearing a crown. In the late 1920s, when most gangsters were still throwing dice in backrooms or barking orders in blood-slick alleyways, Frank Costello walked quietly into the heart of American power and never left. He didn't force his way in. He was invited. Because while men like Capone demanded tribute with Tommy guns and brute reputation, Costello offered something cleaner, something cities were desperate for: order, predictability, discretion. He didn't come with threats. He came with answers. After Prohibition was established in 1920, New York turned into a boiling machine. Speakeasies bloomed like wildflowers in alley corners. Bottles moved in the dark by the thousands. And the old world families, the mustache Petes, still fought over territory with the same tools they'd brought from Sicily: honor, blood, and vendetta. But a new wave of operators, young, American-born, modern, had seen the world change, and they didn't want to fight over blocks. They wanted to organize it. At the center of this evolution was Charles "Lucky" Luciano, and at Luciano's right hand was Frank Costello. Costello wasn't built like a gangster. He didn't care for turf. He didn't control crews. What he offered was more dangerous, a direct line to legitimacy. Through unions, bankers, city planners, judges, and even the halls of Albany and Washington, Frank became the man who could make things happen without drawing a knife. His specialty was the long game. When the Castellammarese War exploded in 1930, a brutal civil conflict among New York's mafia factions, the city became a shooting gallery. Joe, the boss, Masseria on one side, Salvatore Maranzano on the other. Bodies piling up in corners, trucks parked for too long, names erased from memory with one shot and a toss into the East River. Costello didn't orchestrate the violence. He orchestrated the aftermath. Because when Luciano betrayed and murdered both bosses, first Masseria in a Coney Island restaurant, and Maranzano in his Midtown office, it was Costello who helped draw up the new structure. No more bloody coups, no more ancient rivalries, no more single kings. Instead, the commission, 5 families, 1 board, equal power, votes, not executions. At least on the surface. Luciano may have been the architect, but Costello was the contractor. He understood systems, and the commission was a system designed to outlive any one man. After Luciano was arrested in 1936, railroaded on a prostitution charge engineered by Thomas Dewey, Costello didn't scramble for position. He moved upward with quiet inevitability. No banners, no claim of boss, just control. His empire didn't sprawl with rackets the way Genevieve's or Anastasia's did. It was focused, tight, elegant. Gambling was his centerpiece. From Harlem to Louisiana, from local numbers games to full-blown casinos, Costello's touch was everywhere. But unlike others, he didn't just bribe cops. He advised police commissioners. He didn't extort judges. He dined with them. He bought silence with grace. Not with threat, but with favor. In New York, he greased the gears of Tammany Hall, the city's notorious political machine. He wasn't their puppet master. He was their insurance. Need a zoning permit rushed, a rival's contract blocked, a reporter's source to dry up. Frank Costello would handle it. Not through violence, but through access. And when someone pushed back, he didn't retaliate. He waited. Because time was the only currency that always gained value. By 1939, newspapers, those that dared, whispered a new name, the Prime Minister of the underworld. Not because he ruled with terror, but because he ruled with competence. He lived in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria. Same room, same floor, for years. Staff recalled his impeccable manners. He tipped well, never raised his voice, took his coffee black, read 3 papers daily, and left quietly in polished shoes. You'd never guess that from that room. Orders rippled through America's criminal underground. But that was the trick. Costello never looked dangerous. He looked like a solution. In Louisiana, his influence was even deeper. Through connections with Governor Huey Long's old machine, Costello helped expand gambling throughout the state. He backed slot machine deals that funneled tens of thousands back to New York weekly. He didn't run the operations directly. He didn't need to. He placed the right men. He watched. He collected. And in return, he kept the peace. That was always the quiet promise of Frank Costello. Peace for a price. Inside the outfit, his strength wasn't measured in how many men he had behind him. It was how many powerful men returned his phone calls. Senators, district attorneys, archbishops. He attended charity galas. He wrote checks for hospital wings. He posed for no photographs, but his name was on the donation rolls. Some said he bought legitimacy, but really, he rented it. Long enough to stay above water. Even among criminals, he was an anomaly. Anastasia was bloodthirsty. Genovese was jealous. Lucchese was calculating. But Costello was strategic calm. He didn't crave absolute power. He craved balance. Because he understood the cost of chaos. He had seen it. And he had decided he would never drown in it. He never walked with bodyguards. Never rode in convoys. Never hid behind thick-tinted windows. That wasn't bravado. It was confidence in the system he built. A network of favors, respect, and interdependence that insulated him better than any pistol ever could. But power, no matter how soft its touch, always invites envy. As the 1940s ended, a new, hungrier men began to rise. The kind who didn't care for finesse, the kind who missed the sound of breaking glass. Frank Costello began to feel the pressure, from inside his own family, from the FBI, from the public. But still, he never flinched. He poured another glass of whiskey, tucked another envelope into a friend's coat pocket, and kept the wheels turning. Because that was the job, to keep the machine running, to keep the lights on, to keep the storm at bay, even if you didn't get the credit, even if you were just the man behind the curtain. Frank Costello never fired the shot that built his empire. He didn't have to. He just made sure the man who did it had bail, a lawyer, and a warm meal the night before. That was his version of war. No blood, just balance. No screams, just silence bought at the right price. And it worked, for a long, long time. There's a story that circulates, One never printed, never sworn under oath, but always whispered in the darker corners of Manhattan's courthouses. It goes like this. A state judge, late for a ruling that could swing $1 million bid, steps out of his chambers, half drunk, shirt undone, breath thick with bourbon. His clerk tries to steady him. A bailiff offers to call a cab, but the judge waves them off. "I've got dinner with Frank," he says. And nobody asks which Frank. Because in that world, in that year, there was only one, Frank Costello. By the 1940s, Frank no longer moved like a gangster. He moved like a statesman. His office wasn't a backroom bar. It was a suite at the Waldorf Astoria, 15 floors above the street, panelled in walnut, trimmed in brass. A bar cart stood always stocked. 3 kinds of bourbon, 2 bottles of Perrier, a decanter of Lagavulin he never touched. There were no guns on the premises, no muscle, no panic buttons. Just a chair across from his, and a single rule. If you need something, ask. If you can't pay, don't. And the room never emptied. Costello didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. He made judges lean forward, made senators check their ties, made prosecutors blink first. He spoke in low tones, drew circles with a glass in his hand, and understood the deep truth of America's institutions. They weren't built on justice. They were built on favors. And Frank Costello was a master in favors. In New York, he controlled the Tammany Hall machine like a shadow puppeteer, not through orders, but through obligation. Need a building permit expedited? He'd make a call. Want that zoning restriction rephrased? There's a guy in Albany who owes him a weekend. He built his empire not with bricks, but with handshakes, each one a quiet lock on another door. In Louisiana, it was louder. There, he found a kind of wild freedom, the air thick with heat, deals, and oil-slick backroom politics. He partnered with the remnants of Huey Long's machine, invested in slot machines first, small, efficient, invisible, then grew into racetracks and gambling halls across Baton Rouge and New Orleans. By 1944, police departments were pulling tens of thousands of dollars a week in contributions from Costello-backed gambling operations. No arrests, no headlines, just the hum of machines and the clink of coins pouring into carefully greased palms. He knew what people needed, not just crooks, but the respectables. A judge with a mistress who needed quiet support, a senator whose brother drank too much, a mayor whose kid had a gambling debt. Frank didn't judge them, he just solved problems. He never asked for repayment directly. He didn't need to. The next time a bill hit the floor, or a case rose to the Supreme Court docket, or a zoning law came up for a vote, Frank Costello's name didn't appear, but his presence filled the room. At the Waldorf, his day started late. He slept into the morning, preferred moonlight to sunlight, dressed slow, chose his ties with care. His shoes shined daily. Cigarettes burned from the moment he opened the blinds to the moment he closed them again. A bottle of whiskey, not a glass, a bottle, sat uncorked beside the phone. Visitors were offered a pour, most accepted. Because in that room, you didn't say no to Frank. You didn't want to. He had no personal security, never carried a weapon. When asked about it once, he replied with a half smile, "I don't need to carry a gun. I carry people." That was true. His loyalty network was legendary and terrifying in its depth. Doormen, barbers, taxi dispatchers, cigarette girls in hotel lounges, district attorneys, newspaper editors, assistant clerks in the archives of City Hall. If Frank Costello needed to know something, he already did. If he needed someone moved, they were already en route. If someone whispered against him, he'd know the name, the time, and the shoe size of the man who said it, before breakfast. He didn't use this power for spectacle. No splashy murders, no public trials, no violent takedowns of rivals. He hated unnecessary noise. He was a creature of hush. Costello's empire wasn't about brute control. It was about alignment. A racetrack in Yonkers. A casino outside Shreveport. A district judge in Brooklyn with a soft spot for jazz. He'd listen. He'd remember. And one day, that jazz-loving judge would find himself seated beside the director of licensing for New York racing commissions. At a dinner, Frank Costello wasn't even attending. But Frank had arranged the seating chart. He was everywhere and nowhere, like smoke curling around the edges of a mirror. He gave his loyalty carefully, expected the same in return. And when it was broken, rarely, but not never, he didn't yell. He erased. No retribution, no threats. Just quiet, total exclusion. A phone line that stopped working. A handshake that never came. A meeting that never happened. In the underworld, that kind of silence was more chilling than a gunshot. Even J. Edgar Hoover, no friend to the mob, treaded lightly. For years, Costello evaded direct charges, investigations, grand juries. Hoover could barely touch him, because every time the FBI reached out for a file, a warrant, a signature, someone upstairs had just come back from a dinner where the wine was fine, the conversation light, and the bill, of course, had been covered by a mutual friend. Costello's strength was patience. He didn't expand fast. He didn't chase headlines. He didn't fall in love with the sound of his own name. His reward wasn't fame, it was access. In the 1940s, he quietly met with senators behind closed doors, talked policy, listened more than he spoke. When a new National Wire Act was proposed to limit betting over state lines, Frank didn't panic. He advised, suggested alternate phrasing, explained the economic risks, provided real-world case studies, entirely fabricated, of course. The bill died in committee. No one asked why. To the men he dealt with, he wasn't a gangster. He was a gentleman of efficiency. To the criminal world, he wasn't a boss. He was a fixer of impossible problems. And to himself, he was a man who had survived his own ambition. Years later, when his name was whispered in the corridors of Washington or Albany, it wasn't with hatred. It was with a strange mixture of fear and nostalgia. Because Frank Costello, for all his sins, kept the chaos under control. No turf wars, no massacres, no headlines. Just judges on whiskey, politicians on envelopes, and a man who never pulled a trigger, but always hit his mark. The screen was grainy, the camera's eye static, blurred, unfocused, resting not on the face of the man answering questions, but on his hands, one resting, one trembling, one occasionally lifting a glass of water to lips we couldn't see. This was America's first true look at organized crime, not through gunfire or alley whispers, but through the slow crawl of government theater. And the hands belonged to Frank Costello. 1951. The air inside the US Senate chamber was thick with press heat, camera lights, and political tension. Senator Estes Kefauver, tall and square-jawed, framed himself as a new kind of lawman. One not with a badge, but with a subpoena. His mission? To drag the underworld into the daylight. To peel the mystery off names that had lived only in rumors and coded ledgers. To expose the American mafia, family by family, dollar by dollar. And at the center of it, seated quietly behind a microphone, was the man known as the Prime Minister of the underworld. Frank Costello did not want to be there. Not out of fear, out of principle. He had spent decades in smoke and shadows, in back-channel rooms and mid-conversation nods. He wasn't a thug with a pistol or a brute with a string of murders. He was a ghost made of favors, and television could kill ghosts. From the very first moment, it was clear. Costello was rattled. He asked not to be filmed. When that was denied, his attorneys reached a bizarre compromise. Only his hands would be shown. So as senators hurled questions about bribes and bookies, about Tammany Hall and racing interests, America watched a pair of aging hands fidget, twitch, gesture. It was surreal, unnerving, and unforgettable. Those hands, steady when signing backroom agreements, when raising whiskey glasses beside congressmen, now trembled under scrutiny. The voice that emerged from off-camera was gravel-coated and tired, clipped and resigned. Senator, what have you done for your country, Mr. Costello? Costello, paid my tax. The room held its breath, not for the answer, but for how deeply it dripped with contempt. The hearings were spectacle, but to Costello, they were humiliation, not because they proved him guilty, but because they forced him visible. He had always believed in power without fame. Now, television carved his silhouette into the national psyche, without even showing his face. He became a symbol of rot, not for what he'd done, but for how calm he looked doing it. Costello's days were changing. No more quiet cigars at the Waldorf. No more unseen strings pulled behind closed curtains. He was on film now, archived, memed, analyzed. And that terrified him more than any gun ever could. The questions kept coming. Did he know about slot machines in Louisiana? Was he behind the syndicate's influence in New York politics? How did he explain the cash flow, the undeclared income, the sudden appearances of judges at his poker tables? Costello evaded, dodged, lied politely. But the cameras captured something his words didn't. Erosion. Not of power, of myth. For decades, Costello had existed in the margins, powerful because he was never the focus. But now, he was center stage, and the spotlight was scorching. The fallout was swift. Charged with contempt of Congress, then indicted for tax evasion. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. He would serve less, just over a year, thanks to appeals and health claims. But the message was clear. The game was changing. And men like Frank Costello were no longer allowed to play it behind the curtain. When he walked into federal prison in Atlanta, his shoes were shined. His suit was charcoal. His hat, still a soft-brimmed fedora, tipped forward to shield his eyes from press flashbulbs. Inside, he was just inmate number 20349. No whiskey, no judges, no deals. Just metal cots, concrete walls, and the haunting echo of his own voice on national television. But what broke him wasn't the prison. It was the visibility. Costello had never liked fame. He understood it as a liability, a currency that could only be spent once before it turned toxic. He returned to New York older, weaker, thinner, and, for the first time, doubtful. The empire still stood. The racetracks were still humming. The slot machines still ringing in Louisiana. The politicians, at least a few, still made quiet visits to the Waldorf. But something had shifted. The aura of invincibility was gone. People had seen Frank Costello. Not all of him, but enough. And what they saw was a man with tired hands and a fading rhythm. His enemies smelled it. Vito Genovese, long waiting in the wings, began consolidating power. Others whispered that Frank had grown soft. The prison had humbled him. The television had made him human. And humans can bleed. The myth was wounded. Still, Costello tried to regain control. He hosted fewer dinners, kept his circle smaller, avoided the press, tried to melt back into the mist he'd once ruled so easily. But in post-Kefauver America, the mist had burned away. Now, every district attorney wanted a headline. Every young senator dreamed of their own televised takedown. And Costello was no longer untouchable. He was a precedent. There's a clip, rarely shown, from the final day of Costello's testimony. The hearing is nearly over. The senators have moved on to another witness. But the camera, disobedient, almost curious, lingers. And in that moment, we see his hand move slowly across the table. Fingers trace the edge of the microphone, pause, then curl into a fist. Not out of rage, out of exhaustion. It's the gesture of a man who knows he has been unmade, not by violence or betrayal, but by the very country he once bought piece by piece. He was never the same again. The Waldorf suite grew quiet. The phone rang less. His name still meant something, but less. Judges no longer leaned in. Senators no longer dined with him in public. And when someone whispered Frank Costello in a back room, it was often followed by another whisper. He's finished. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. For years, he lingered on. A ghost still flickering in boardrooms and betting parlors. But the force that had once bent institutions to his will was fractured, split, like his face from his voice, like the man from the myth, like the old world of the mafia from the new. Television gave America many firsts. A war broadcast live, a president assassinated, a moon landing. But long before those, it gave the nation something colder. The slow unraveling of a king without a crown. Frank Costello never smiled on camera. But if you watch closely, at the hands, at the moments between questions, you might see something worse. A twitch, a shudder, a loss. The moment when even the most careful man realized he'd been seen. The marble tiles still held a faint echo, not of footsteps, but of something sharper. The sound of a bullet splitting air at close range, of power surrendering, not with a signature, but a graze across the scalp. It was May 2nd, 1957. Evening had just begun to settle over Manhattan, and inside the lobby of 115 Central Park West, Frank Costello was supposed to be untouchable. He had walked this path hundreds of times, from the revolving doors, past the concierge, into the elevator, his gait calm, his mind occupied with schedules, not threats. There were no bodyguards, no car waiting. He didn't need them, not anymore. The city respected him, feared him, yes, but also accepted him. Costello was a man too public to be harmed, and that illusion ended in the space of a second. The figure stepped from the shadows near the stairwell, younger, nervous. His hand didn't tremble as he raised the pistol, but his soul did. Vincent Chin Gigante had been sent by someone who'd run out of patience, Vito Genovese. The shot cracked like lightning in a museum. It tore the silence clean. The bullet caught the left side of Costello's head, not deep, but enough to draw blood, enough to drop him. He collapsed near the elevator, not from pain, but from shock. This wasn't supposed to happen to a man like him. The shooter fled. No words, no second shot, just silence. Again, followed by the slow, shocked footsteps of a doorman, unsure if the body on the floor was alive or legendary. Costello lived, barely. The bullet had grazed him, sliced skin, not skull. He was taken to Roosevelt Hospital, eyes open, blood staining the collar of his coat. When asked who had shot him, Costello, dazed but lucid, simply said, "I don't know, and I wouldn't tell you if I did." He survived the bullet, but not the moment. That single shot didn't kill Frank Costello. It moved him, out of power, out of sight, and into history's darker corners. In the days that followed, whispers moved faster than headlines. Vito Genovese had finally made his move. The long game of waiting, for prison to take Costello, for politics to ruin him, had failed. So Genovese sent a gunman instead. But something strange happened. Costello didn't retaliate. He didn't gather allies. He didn't demand revenge. He stepped back. Officially, he retired. Unofficially, he relinquished control to Genovese, who promptly renamed the organization the Genovese Family, erasing Costello's name from its future. And yet, Costello didn't disappear entirely. He faded into whispers, into long lunches with old friends, into quiet walks through Central Park, into a different kind of power, the kind held not through fear, but memory. He still knew judges. He still knew secrets. And every now and then, when someone needed a door open or a case dismissed, they'd call the old number, and he'd answer, softly. The bullet had done what prison couldn't. It shook the myth. It forced him to confront the slow erosion of legacy, to see that even ghosts could be hunted. And for the rest of his life, Frank Costello would carry that wound, not on his head, but in the space between what he had been and what he now chose to become. In that marble lobby, beneath the chandelier, blood had touched the floor. Not a lot, just enough. Enough to signal that the Prime Minister of the underworld was no longer king. The last suit he wore was blue, dark, double-breasted, wool, pressed perfectly, no wrinkles. It lay on the chair beside his bed when the heart gave out. No blood, no headlines, no last stand, just silence, and the low hum of a radio playing in the kitchen downstairs. On February 18th, 1973, Frank Costello died the way almost no one in his world ever did, quietly. No handcuffs, no gunman, no spotlight. He died of a heart attack in his Manhattan apartment, with nobody trying to stop it. It had been nearly 2 decades since the shot in the lobby, since Genovese had taken the reins, since the Senate hearings blurred his face into myth, since the Waldorf Astoria and the backroom judges and the Southern tracks whispered his name daily. But Costello remained. He lived long enough to see Luciano buried in Naples, to see Capone rot from the inside out, to see Genovese die in prison, forgotten. He outlasted them all. There was something strange about that, something deliberate. Costello hadn't vanished. He had simply stepped to the side, let the noise pass, let the younger wolves tear each other apart, let the suits change, let the laws bend, let the headlines chase someone else. In his final years, he wore the same uniform, tailored jackets, open collars, polished shoes, the armor of a man who never needed a pistol, because charm, real charm, doesn't need a trigger. He still took calls, still gave advice, still played both ends of certain cases, but only if asked, only if it mattered. He became a ghost that walked in daylight. There's a photograph taken in 1970 at a restaurant in Manhattan. Costello sits by a window, sipping espresso, his hands folded neatly, as if waiting for a deal that would never come. His eyes, tired but amused, glance off to the side, like he sees something we don't. Not fear, not regret, just memory. What do we call a man who survives the thing he helped create? Not a traitor, not a coward, but maybe a witness. Costello didn't crave violence. He used it when necessary, through others, but preferred the pen to the blade, the phone call to the bullet. To him, power wasn't imposed, it was invited. It walked beside you, smiled across the table, offered a drink. That was his brilliance and his curse. He made corruption elegant. He wore it like a silk glove. The commission had been born in smoke and gunfire, but Costello had pressed a handkerchief to its collar, straightened its tie, taught it how to speak in City Hall and sip whiskey without spilling. He was the man who told gangsters to stop shooting each other, not for morality, but for profit. In the end, there were no scandals, no surprise indictments, no final testimonies, just silence, and a single heart that stopped in the quiet. The funeral was small, few names, fewer headlines. Most who knew him were dead. Those who remained had learned the same lesson. The smartest man in the room is the one who leaves early and walks alone. The blue suit remained on the chair. It never made the papers, but it outlived Capone's madness, Luciano's exile, Genovese's ambition, even the Commission's golden age. It outlived the mob itself, just like the man who used to wear it.